Welcome friends. In this video we will try to simplify the structure and function of brain. So brain is roughly divided into three parts, that is forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. Forebrain includes cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus. Hindbrain includes cerebellum, pons and medulla oblongata. Now let's look at the structure and function of brain. This is a typical diagram of a brain. Now this brain is well protected in brain box or cranium of the skull. Again, it is covered up by three layers: outer layer, innermost layer and the middle layer. So the outer layer is dura mater, which is tough and fibrous membrane. The innermost layer, which is close to the brain, is soft layer. We call it as pia mater. And the middle layer, which is something web-like structure, this is arachnoid matter. So these three layers together gives out meninge of brain, or in other words we say covering of brain. So this was the protection of brain. Let's see the structure and function of brain. This dome-shaped structure is cerebrum, and this cerebrum occupies almost 80% of brain. And if we notice, this cerebrum is not a plane in surface. Instead, we find there are many folds. We find there are many foldings, somewhat like this. And these foldings we call it as gyri. These gyries are surrounded by this depression called sulci. So the cerebrum is made up of gyri and sulci. This is only to increase the surface area of the cerebrum so that it can store more number of neurons. Okay. Now this diagram is, we see this brain in one particular direction. This one view of this brain diagram. When we see it from the top view is going to be different. We see that this cerebrum is divided into two parts, two hemispheres, that is right hemisphere and left hemisphere. And these two hemispheres are connected by a connection called corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Okay. Again, this cerebrum contains four sections or four lobes. So this was our corpus callosum. This cerebrum is divided into four parts. It contains four sections or four lobes. That is frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. And these four lobes contains their own function. They carry out their own set of functions. So let's see where these four lobes are located in the cerebrum and see what are their functions. Suppose this is the cerebrum. Okay, as the name suggests, the first lobe is going to be the front portion, the frontal lobe. And this area of the brain is mainly responsible for the language that we speak, for the emotions that we show, our personality and our movements. All this is controlled by this frontal lobe. Behind to this frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe. This parietal lobe is mainly its main area for sensation. Sensation like touch sensation, like we touch too hot, cold, pressure, pain, all these things we can sense. So this is controlled by this parietal lobe. Down to this parietal lobe is the temporal lobe. Temporal. This temporal lobe is near to the ear. Suppose this is ear, so it's close to the ear. This lobe is of course going, if it is close to the ear, of course is going to take part in auditory functions such as selective listenings, our emotions, long-term memory. So all these things is stored in this controlled by this temporal lobe. And the last lobe is, that is occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain somewhere here. It is directly connected to our eyes and it takes part in visual processing. So whatever the image is formed in front of, whatever we see, all those images are formed here and we are informed by this occipital lobe. So this was about cerebrum. Now in general, if we speak the functions of cerebrum, we can tell that this particular area, the cerebrum, is mainly involved in voluntary action. It controls all voluntary actions. Like we are learning, problem solving, imagination, our creativity, vision, our movements, all these things is controlled by this cerebrum. Okay, this was cerebrum. Now this is the first part of the forebrain. We are done with cerebrum. Now we come to the second part of forebrain, that is thalamus. So thalamus we find somewhere just about to this midbrain. So this small section is midbrain. Just talk to this midbrain, we find small structure, that is thalamus. And this thalamus is made up of grey matter, meaning that it houses neurons. That's why it takes part in sensory and motor functions. This thalamus takes part in sensory and motor functions. Like it is going to sense, accordingly it's going to take action. Like for example, when we sense some bad smell, when we sense something bad, what we do, we try to move out from that area. So according to that we take action. So that is controlled by this thalamus. Now after this thalamus is the third part of brain, which is hypothalamus. And hypothalamus is near to this pituitary gland. So this is the pituitary gland. Near to this pituitary gland, we find hypothalamus. Somewhere here. This region, this small region of the brain is very much important, highly responsible for controlling our body temperature. Hypothalamus. This hypothalamus controls our body temperature. Along with body temperature, it also secretes some hormones. Secretion of hormones, our sleep cycle, hunger, all these things is controlled by this hypothalamus. So cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus. Forebrain is over. Now we come to the second part of brain, that is midbrain. This particular. Only this small section is awarded for midbrain. If we take out this midbrain and see, if we take out this particular structure, midbrain, and see, it looks like somewhat like this. We find that this midbrain contains two heavy fiber tracts. There are two heavy fiber tracts and we call it as cerebral peduncle. And this cerebral peduncle connects or joins hindbrain with forebrain. It helps in also whatever the signals or whatever the essential information is passed on, that can be passed on from cerebrum to hindbrain. Okay. Now at the posterior side of this cerebral peduncle, we find there are four circles. At the back of this peduncle, there are four circles: upper two circles and lower two circles. Upper two circles we call it as superior colliculi. And it takes part in our visual processing. Lower two circles is inferior colliculi, which controls our auditory reflexes. So this was midbrain. Down to this midbrain we find parts of hindbrain. So hindbrain includes pons. Let me just write it. This was midbrain. Down to this midbrain is hindbrain. First part of hindbrain, that is pons. Pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. This particular structure. Okay. This pons is made up of many nerve fibers. So those nerve fibers are directly connected to this cerebellum. So it houses many nucleus. So it helps, this pons helps in passing information from cerebrum to cerebellum. So it takes part in transferring informations. And if we notice at back of this, behind to this pons, we find the second largest portion of the brain, that is cerebellum. And this cerebellum, like cerebrum, is also divided into two parts. It also has two hemispheres, and those two hemispheres are connected by vermis. This connection we call it as vermis. This cerebellum maintains our body posture and body balance. It helps, like iron standing, walking, running, dancing, all these things is possible due to this cerebellum, second largest portion of the brain. It also helps in coordination, like coordination of eye movements and etc. Okay. After the cerebellum, we find the last portion, the last part of the brain, that is medulla oblongata, which is at the lowermost part of the brain, which is situated at the lowermost part of the brain, that is medulla oblongata. This medulla oblongata is a center for vomiting, sneezing, coughing. It also controls our breathing. Along with breathing, relaxation and contraction of blood vessels, secretion of essential hormones, secretion of saliva, all these things are done in this small portion of the brain, in the lowermost part of the brain, that is medulla oblongata. And down to the medulla oblongata is the spinal cord. And one more thing, midbrain, pons and this medulla oblongata together, they form a stem-like structure. So we call it as brain stem. So midbrain, pons plus medulla oblongata, these three together we call it as brain stem. So this was about structure and function of brain.